Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our webinar with Dr. Piotr Puchalski. I'm at the Pilsudski Institute of America, and Dr. Puchalski is in New York. However, we are connecting by email online, and usually Dr. Puchalski stays in Poland and Kraków, but today we are both in New York City. I would like to say a few words before I introduce and welcome our guest about the Institute. The Pilsudski Institute of America is a non-for-profit educational center. You can see some of our collection behind me. We have archives, library, and special archival collection. Anyone can use our collection. You can visit us at www.pilsudski.org. You can also use our resources, our online programs as well. In-person visiting is available at this moment. You can just let us know and we will assist you. So I'm very happy to have our special guest today. I would like to welcome Dr. Piotr Puchalski. We are so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Korga, for this general introduction and for inviting me to this renowned institution, which of course I have many links to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So today we will talk about Dr. Puchalski's book, which was just published, and it's titled Poland in a Colonial World Order, Adjustments and Aspirations, 1918-1939. Before I will give floor to our guest, I will introduce Dr. Piotr Puchalski. He is Assistant Professor of Modern History at the Pedagogical University of Kraków in Poland, where he offers courses in the history of Poland, colonial empires, international relationship, and contemporary tourism. He has previously published in the Historical Journal and the Journal of Modern European History. He holds a bachelor's degree from New York University and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I would like to mention that Dr. Piotr Puchalski has been a volunteer at the Institute for many years, and as I can remember, his first open to the public lecture happened many years ago at the Institute in 2013. So I'm very happy to have such a great guest with us, and we will talk today about the book. And first, Dr. Piotr Puchalski will give us short introduction. So the floor is yours, and we are waiting for all the information about the book, subjects, and how it happened that you have written this book.
Thank you once again for the invitation. It's really an honor to be giving a talk, albeit online, at the Pilsudski Institute of America. It's an institution with a history that's incredible, and it's a real honor. So the title of my book is, as Dr. Korga already mentioned, Poland in a Colonial World Order. Subtitle is Adjustments and Aspirations, 1918 to 1939. And in fact, I many years ago, in 2013, I gave my first talk about one aspect of this topic, which was the Polish mission to Liberia, which I will briefly mention later on. But most broadly, the topic of my book is Poland's relationship with colonialism during the interwar period in the years that I mentioned, 1918 to 1939. In the book, I describe how the Polish elites, especially the supporters of Józef Pilsudski, attempted to solve a series of domestic problems by engaging with global systems of governance. These problems included industrial stagnation, agricultural unemployment, and undercapitalization, as well as ethnic tensions, especially in relations to Jews and Ukrainians. And this I will also elaborate on a bit later. And furthermore, engaging in forms of colonialism also offered Poland an escape from its geopolitical deadlock. You well know that interwar Poland was, of course, located between Germany, later Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union, and colonialism, or engaging in a form of it, was seen as escaping this geopolitical quagmire. In the book, I trace how Polish thinking about colonialism changed, and how Polish statesmen such as Gustav Orlik-Drescher, Apolloniusz Zarychta, and Wiktor Drymer adjusted their policies to changes around the world. So in a way, my book is also a portrait of the interwar world order, which I consider colonial in its very nature. And maybe let me explain that briefly. So after the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, you can see the emergence of a couple of colonial systems. This is something we often forget about. In the first place, we have the League of Nations, which was created at the conference and took charge of the mandate system. Former German colonies, such as Cameroon and Togo, as well as Ottoman provinces, such as Palestine and Mesopotamia, became mandates which were administered by the Western powers. Of course, most of them were hard to distinguish from colonies, but there was nevertheless some international pressure to turn Category A mandates into independent countries. And this, of course, you might know this happened in the case of Mesopotamia, which became Iraq in 1932. So this was the first colonial system that emerged after World War I. In the second place, you also have the British Empire, which was, of course, in the process of expanding and changing. The British reached their territorial peak by acquiring mandates in the Middle East and Africa. But the pressure from the League of Nations, as well as the Great Depression, encouraged London to grant a growing degree of political sovereignty to their colonies and protectorates. We have the Statute of Westminster of 1931, which confirmed the independence of the dominions such as Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, although of course Britain maintained its influence there as well. And even in West Africa, following the advice of Frederick Lugard, the British began to practice indirect rule. So you have the British Empire morphing, becoming less formal and more informal, giving more political sovereignty to its subject entities, let's say. And next, the interwar period was also the time of a modest expansion of the French, Belgian, Portuguese, and Dutch empires as well. These empires were more state-based, ruled their colonies directly, and encouraged indigenous participation in the imperial project only insofar as Africans or Asians assimilated into the dominant French or Portuguese cultures. The Portuguese Empire, in particular, was the most old school in that Lisbon promoted continuous white settlement and racial hierarchies of power. And finally, there was the informal US Empire in the Philippines in the West and the Caribbean in the East. And this was, of course, connected by the Panama Canal. This empire was based on the idea of free trade and soft power. And it was controlled by an alliance of tycoons, philanthropists, and statesmen. So a very informal form of empire. And of course, there was also the Soviet form of colonialism in Central Asia, but maybe I'll put that on the side as it's not a major topic in my book. So to summarize, my book tells the story of how Polish statesmen interacted with these colonial systems that I just mentioned and transitioned between them to solve the problems that I mentioned earlier, namely agrarian unemployment, industrial stagnation, and I will delve deeper into different aspects of the book a bit later, but I believe that Dr. Korga has some questions for me, so maybe I'll stop here for now.
Okay, so now, as we know a little more about the book, I have a few questions to ask, and I hope that this will help our audience to also understand more the book. Also, I should mention that anyone who would like to ask the question can do it over the Q&A or via chat. I will present the question later on by the end of our talk. So my first question is, actually, I would like to show the book to everyone. I have the book in front of me, and the book can be purchased via Amazon. It's available, and it's really nicely done. So I think anyone will be happy to have it. So looking at the questions, my first question is for Dr. Puchalski. Can you please present the origin of Polish colonial aspirations?
Of course. So I think in the first place, we need to discuss Poland's position shortly after World War I. So as you know, the Polish lands unite after 1918. An independent Polish state is established from 4 different economic, political, and legal systems, right? From the former Prussian partition, the Grand Duchy of Poznań, West Prussia, Upper Silesia, from the Russian partition, the Kingdom of Poland, from Galicia, the Austrian partition, and of course, the Polish armies also manage in the years 1918 to 1921 capture lands from Soviet Russia in the east, right, which had not been parts of the Russian partition, were directly incorporated into the Russian Empire. So we have these different political and economic systems that come together to form this new state, and this new state is dealing with all sorts of problems. Well, in the first place, of course, there is the destruction that is wrought on the Polish lands by World War I. You have 1.7 million houses destroyed. You have 4.45 million hectares of agricultural land rendered useless. So great destruction, and of course, political infighting. Population growth is immense in the interwar period. It increases from 26 million to 35 million between 1918 and 1939. In 1925, Poland is waging a tariff war against Germany. It's constantly looking for new export destinations for Silesian coal as a result of this. And then, of course, comes the Great Depression in 1929, continues, into the late 30s. You have the phenomenon of price scissors that affects the Polish economy. After October 1929, prices of agricultural products fall by 60%, while prices of industrial products remained more steady. So just to illustrate what this means, by 1935, farmers need to sell twice the amount of produce to buy the same amount of consumer goods as in 1929. Agriculture is in shambles. You see, especially in the 1930s, the emergence of the so-called dwarf farms, very small plots that are not productive. Only 10% of farms in Poland bring real profit. And this is a result of this industrial stagnation that I mentioned earlier. So Poland needs to use hard currency to buy raw materials, which are very expensive, nevertheless, despite the Great Depression, and it has very little money left to develop industry, which means that industry stagnates and industry is not able to absorb these excess peasants from the countryside. So these peasants travel to cities because of unemployment, but there's no employment for them in the cities. So this is a huge problem. And this is also a result of the fact that Poland sticks to the gold standard for geopolitical reasons. Unlike other powers, it cannot abandon the gold standard because it needs to finance its debt to the French in particular. And this is for geopolitical reasons because, of course, Poland needs the French alliance again against Nazi Germany. And finally, you need to look for origins of these colonial aspirations in the fact that 3 million Jews live in Poland. This is the second largest population of Jews in the world. And this results in ethnic tension between Christians and Jews in towns and cities, where Christians coming from this overpopulated countryside are trying to get jobs in the industry, but also in professions like law, medicine. and there they encounter Jews occupying these professions, and that of course generates great tension, which morphs into anti-Semitism. Which is why you see the emergence of, for example, the Madagascar project, which I can elaborate on later. So the Polish statesmen such as Gustav Orlich-Descher, such as Apollonius Zarychta, they see some form of engagement with colonialism as a solution to the problem of industrial stagnation, from which all these other problems seem to stem. The idea is that if Poland acquires some economic and political privileges in countries in South Africa, in South America, in Africa, then it can obtain raw materials more cheaply, and this way it can save money to develop the industry. So I would say that is the origin of colonial aspirations that I discuss in my book.
Thank you. So now when we know what was the situation of Polish Second Republic in 1918 and later on, and about all these problems, I can ask about the directions of the planned Polish colonial expansions and why did it change in later years. So what was first and what happened later on and why it changed?
Sure. So in the first place, even before the Great Depression in the 1920s, the late 1920s, these Polish statesmen understand colonial policies as an extension of emigration policies. The idea is that since many peasants are leaving Poland for South America, in particular the southern states of Brazil, such as Paraná, Santa Catarina, also the region of Misiones in Argentina, since these peasants are leaving the Polish shores for a better life in these areas of South America that are considered pre-modern, that are sparsely inhabited, that offer large swaths of lands to be farmed, that offer a richness of raw materials, the Polish state can use these people, transform them into colonists, and turn their settlements into sort of Polish colonies existing in these independent countries. So this is the first direction of Polish colonial expansion, so to speak, to consolidate existing pre-World War I settlements in South America and reinforce them with Polish agricultural experts, Polish consuls, right, to establish the diplomatic apparatus around them, so that these so-called colonies can provide raw materials to the Polish state more cheaply. They can serve both as producers and intermediaries for the sale, the exportation of these raw materials such as cotton, coffee, rubber to Poland. But this policy, the set of policies fails in the late 1920s, early 1930s because of the Great Depression, because in fact, South America begins to industrialize as a result of the Great Depression, and it becomes more nationalistic, in particular Brazil. So first of all, South America no longer offers so much land for Polish immigrants to farm, and it's now wary of these settlements, homogeneous settlements emerging within its borders, because it wants to Brazilianize its population. It wants it to speak only Portuguese, not Polish or German or Italian. So there is a backlash from the Brazilian president Getúlio Vargas in the early 1930s, which forces the Polish statesmen to evaluate what colonial policies really are or ought to be. And this results in Africa becoming the geographic focus of Polish expansion. And this expansion becomes less of an emigration policy and more of a commercial policy. Now the idea is to pose Polish investors, Polish settlers, as partners of the Portuguese in colonies such as Angola. So Poland is advertising itself as a junior partner of Portuguese colonialism. And this works for about a year, let's say, I don't know, between 1931 to 1932. But then Salazar, this authoritarian ruler of Portugal, decides that in fact it doesn't trust the Polish colonists in Angola. They're posing a threat. There might actually be closet Germans. There is this rumor that the Germans with Polish passports are infiltrating Angola. And of course, Germany at the time is becoming more and more authoritarian, more and more Nazi. So this settlement in the highlands of Angola, on the high plateau of Angola near the mission of Puipeio, is also not very successful. And once again, the direction of Polish colonial expansion needs to change. And now the target becomes Liberia. Liberia was an independent country in West Africa at the time, but it had a problem with slavery. It was in fact accused by the League of Nations, the British and the Americans, of practicing something akin to slavery, of trafficking human beings on the island of Fernando Po, using them as slave laborers, forced laborers. So Liberia is in fact in danger of becoming a mandate, and it turns to Poland for help because Poland has some leverage in the League of Nations, in the international arena. And Poland is also a rapporteur of the Liberian question in Geneva. So there is a secret deal struck between the Poles, in particular the Maritime and Colonial League of Poland and the Liberian government, whereby Polish companies, Polish settlers receive all kinds of privileges in Liberia in exchange for Polish diplomatic help in Geneva. And there's also a secret plan forged by the Maritime and Colonial League and the Foreign Ministry of Poland to use the Polish plantations, which emerge as in Liberia, in the hinterland of Liberia, as sort of a center of subterfuge and sabotage in Liberia. And there's an attempt to in fact incite an indigenous uprising against the Liberian government, and to use the Polish economic advisor to the Liberian government to take financial control of the country. So it's a very, very complicated adventure that the Polish statesmen undertake in that particular country, while posing as anti-colonialists. So this makes things even more complicated. Of course, as Poland is helping Liberia diplomatically, its Polish settlers are also advertising themselves as anti-colonialists while doing something quite colonial in the background. So that's yet another direction of this expansion. And then there's the Madagascar Plan, right? The Madagascar Plan, which I don't know if I should talk about now, perhaps later.
Yes, you can talk about it now, since we are talking about different directions and places where the colonialism went.
Right. So the origin of the Madagascar Plan can be traced to the mid-1930s, when Nazi Germany was raising its head and beginning the first discrimination against Jews. And that's when you see different Jewish organizations looking for places where Jews can emigrate to from Europe. And in 1937, in January of 1937, there is a rumor that this one particular Jewish organization has asked the French government to allow a mass Jewish settlement in northern Madagascar. And in reaction to this rumor, Józefbeck, Poland's foreign minister, makes inquiries with the French ambassador, Léon Noël, whether as to whether this is true and whether perhaps the Polish government can participate in this venture and can help colonize Madagascar with Polish Jewish settlers, colonists, immigrants, call them what you will. And this is partly, of course, an attempt by the Polish government to fulfill Poland's colonial aspirations. But of course, on the other hand, this is also a nod to the extreme right in Poland, to the extreme right-wing opposition and to the anti-Semites, because of course these groups are advocating for reduction of the Polish population in Poland to ease the ethnic tension between Christians and Poles in towns and cities and so on. So this is a strange combination of Polish colonial aspirations and anti-Semitism, whereby Jews are imagined leaving Poland in large numbers to Madagascar, but also serving there on the great island of Madagascar as Polish economic intermediaries, which will enable the Polish industry to import raw materials from Madagascar at lower prices. So yes, so we of course have this this anti-Semitic turn in Polish colonial policies as well, this anti-Semitic element, and the two are sort of competing with each other. So that's another interesting thread that I discuss in my book. And I think that I will maybe stop here and wait for another question.
Yes, thank you. Very good. So we can move to next question, and actually it will be the next chapter in the explanation about the book. I would like to ask about Minister Józefbeck's policy. Did he support Polish colonial aspiration? His name came out already, so I think our audience is really interested in how Minister Józefbeck policy is included in this colonial aspirations.
Yes, so this is a question that warrants a complicated answer, which I will try to deliver in simple terms. So Józefbeck was not the greatest fan of Polish colonial aspirations being carried out through this organization that I mentioned earlier, the Polish Maritime and Colonial League. In particular, Beck thought that this mission to Liberia was too ambitious and too unrealistic. And at the end of the day, he was proven right. It was too ambitious. The Polish settlers, the Polish companies, the League should have probably stuck to enlarging Polish sphere of economic influence in Liberia, but instead they, as I mentioned earlier, attempted to overthrow the Liberian government. And this came to the attention of the United States, which was virtually a protector of Liberia. The United States treated Liberia as their colony, in essence, and this resulted in the Polish plantations and the Polish shops and the Polish mission altogether being all but evacuated by 1938. So Beck thought this was unrealistic, but nevertheless he did believe that Poland did have a right to some colonial concessions in other powers' colonies, in British colonies, in French colonies, Belgian colonies, and so on. But he believed that the best way of acquiring such concessions was through the League of Nations. So in late 1936, Beck commissioned Drimmer and other Polish diplomats to draft the Polish colonial theses, which listed the arguments for Poland's influence in the colonial world. And these theses, in a very gentle form, were presented in Geneva to the Assembly, but also to the Council of the League of Nations in the fall of 1936. And Polish diplomats were also commissioned by Beck to propose international solutions to the problems that plagued the Polish industry and the Polish countryside. So, for example, there was a proposition to introduce an international currency by which Poland could purchase raw materials also in the colonies. There was a suggestion to include a Polish expert in the Permanent Mandates Commission, who would then lobby this commission to internationalize colonialism, so that all colonies would be turned into sort of mandates, free trade zones where Poland, but also other countries could purchase raw materials more cheaply. So back in the years 1936, 1937, hoped that such propositions would find some understanding among British and French colleagues, diplomats, experts, but this wasn't the case. The British and the French worried that granting any concessions to the Poles would open Pandora's box, create a precedence that would lead to Nazi Germany, for example, having a right and a good reason to, for example, demand the return of its former colonies, or demand even larger concessions. And of course, they just didn't want to share any resources with Poland. I mean, let's face it. Empires are jealous of their own privileges, so it's hard to imagine that they would gift anything to a third country. So Beck notices this failure, and then he starts using colonial aspirations as a diplomatic instrument, as diplomatic leverage in relations with other powers. For example, in 1938, around the time of the Munich conference, there is talk of colonial appeasement. So Britain and France offering Hitler concessions in the Congo, for example, in the Belgian Congo, or even Portuguese Angola, which we already talked about, in exchange for peace in Europe. Of course, the British did not want to return former German colonies to the Reich directly, but they instead proposed concessions, right? Because of course they didn't want to. They didn't want such return of the German colonies to threaten their interests around the Suez Canal and the road to India and so on. So Beck sees that there is this slim chance that perhaps the British and the French would be willing to carve out a German concession in the Belgian Congo or elsewhere. So he presses on with this idea, and he draws the international public's attention to the colonial question, the so-called colonial question, and it's then that we see this increase in colonial propaganda in Poland. You have in April 1938, for example, right after the Anschluss of Austria, we see parades in major Polish cities where people, carry signs and symbols evoking the colonies and all the riches that might come from the colonies. The slogan is "We demand colonies for Poland," right? So Beck influences the Maritime and Colonial League to stage these celebrations, this colonial propaganda, to draw the international public's attention to the colonial question, in the hope that the weight of German aggression will tilt toward Africa. This is, of course, a false hope, as we know. Hitler was not as interested in Africa as he was in Lebensraum in Eastern Europe, but at the time it did seem to be a plausible strategy, diplomatic strategy. And he uses colonial aspirations in different ways as a diplomatic instrument. He, for example, threatens at one point the British and the French with colonial aspirations to force them to sit at the table with him, to negotiate better terms of the military alliance in March 1939, but that's a slightly different issue. I think that I've answered the question about Beck. So
yes, absolutely. Thank you very much, because it gives us more understanding of the subject. And I have one more final question, which is partly already explained, but maybe there is anything else that have to be added, so I will ask it. Can you tell us what was the role of Jewish people in this colonial Polish plans, how it works, how it played?
Yes. Initially, before 1936, before the closing of Palestine, the British mandate of Palestine to Jewish immigration, the Polish statesmen considered Jews useful in the colonies, useful to the Polish state. They considered them as potential intermediaries, as merchants who have contacts all over the world, including in the colonies, for example, in South Africa, but also in Southeastern Africa, in the Rhodesias. So people who are useful to the Polish state abroad. But after 1936, when Jewish emigration from Poland becomes smaller and slower, the priority is not to use Jews as colonial agents. The priority of the Polish government is to find other places to which Jews can immigrate to find the so-called national home, a second national home for Jews in addition to Palestine, which simply cannot welcome so many immigrants anymore because the British forbid it, because the British are worried about the Jewish-Arab tensions. There's a riot in Jaffa in 1936, and this is sort of the catalyst for that. So there's this switch in 1936 when Jews become less desirable as colonial intermediaries for the Polish state and more of a nuisance and a liability at home. So that's when you see the emergence of the Madagascar Project. But there is still this lingering conflict between the anti-Semitic idea, which is of course not the same as the Nazi German anti-Semitic idea. It's, it has a basis in social and economic affairs, so to speak. There's still this tension between this anti-Semitic idea and the colonial idea. So in Madagascar, the Polish state, when they talk about Madagascar, the Polish statesmen are not sure if they should just leave the Jews alone there, or they should try to come up with some kind of a collaboration with them to exploit natural riches and to increase trade. And there is, until late 1939, about June 1939, and there is still a Jewish company in Southeastern Africa called Międzyrzecki, named after its owner, CEO, we could say nowadays, that is very successful in creating this network of trade between in the region, and promoting Polish imports in South Africa, the Union of South Africa, in the Rhodesias, in Portuguese Mozambique. So there's Polish Jewish companies operating in the region until June 1939 with full blessing from the Polish government. So this is sort of a marriage of convenience between the Jews and the Poles, right, in this colonial setting. So it's not as clear-cut as it seems to be at first sight. 1936 is a breaking point that separates the two policies, but there's there's some continuity in viewing the Jews as Polish colonial agents well into 1939.
Okay, thank you. This helps us to understand the book and have some ideas about this, I would say, rather not well-known part of our second Polish Republic history. I won't ask any more questions because we might have questions from the audience. We actually have one and I have few. So I would like to thank you for answering the questions, and we will move to Q&A because this may help our audience to have a chance to get in touch with our guests. So first question is, to what extent did your average Pole, as opposed to officialdom, see prospect of colonialism? I believe there was an organization active in interwar period called the Colonial League. What exactly did it promote? And was it popular?
Should I answer this question now or wait for?
Yes, yes, this is the question to answer.
So thank you very much for this question. It's a good one. It's a one that I find difficult to answer because, in fact, I did focus on state policies as opposed to sort of domestic reception of colonial propaganda, colonial aspirations, and so on. But I can say that with likelihood, the average Pole, also the average Ukrainian and the average Jew probably did hear of Poland's ambitions in the colonial world by 1939. The propaganda was quite widespread. The colonial days of April 1938, for example, did draw crowds that counted tens of thousands in the cities. But they also tried to penetrate the countryside with this message that colonies were a panacea for Poland's socioeconomic problems. They printed all kinds of posters that were geared specifically to the working class, to the peasant, to some extent also to the minorities. I mean, the Jews in particular, for obvious reasons. Whether the average Pole supported this colonial idea, this colonial ideology, these dreams, that's more difficult to answer. Many of them, many Poles, but then again, we're talking now about the educated class, did oppose them, in fact. The moderate right and the extreme right opposed them because they thought that colonization should first take place in the east, in Polesia. The swamps should be drained first. Poland should really focus on sort of upbringing that area in the first place. That was the stance of the moderate right. The extreme right was actually upset that instead of looking for colonies for Poland, Warsaw was looking for colonies for the Jews. So in fact, the Jews and the extreme right formed this weird alliance whereby they both opposed the Madagascar project, for example. But as to the reception by the average peasant, he was probably fascinated by sort of the exoticism of the idea, I would assume. Probably thought that it was crazy. But again, I don't know if penetrating the heads of peasants and sort of the lower strata of society was ever the goal of the Maritime and Colonial League or the Polish government. I frankly don't think that they care that much whether these people really believed in the colonial idea, as long as they didn't vocally oppose it. So that's really the best answer I can give you at the moment. But thank you again for the question.
I think there is one question in the same about Colonial League. So maybe you can explain that organization, how it worked, whether it was popular, and did it have any particular developments or impact for the politics, for colonial aspirations?
Yes, so I might have failed to mention this in my answers to your questions, Ivona, but the Polish government until 1936 used the Maritime and Colonial League as its proxy. So, for example, the treaty between Liberia and Poland was actually signed between Liberia and the Maritime and Colonial League. So this, of course, harkens back to the 17th century when trade companies signed colonial treaties with countries, and sort of monarchs used organizations to colonize, right, instead of doing it themselves, instead of sort of employing the state apparatus to do it. So the League was the government's proxy until 1936, when it comes to actual colonial projects in Angola and Liberia. And then after that year, it becomes merely dedicated to propaganda within Poland. And the Polish government actually uses different organizations that do not contain the word colonial in their names as its agencies abroad, because the Polish government becomes more wary of the fact that Portugal, Britain, France, they're all becoming suspicious as soon as they see colonial written anywhere in the logo of an organization that is trying to purchase land in Mozambique or elsewhere. So yes, so it's a proxy organization. And of course, the reason why its colonial message becomes so popular is because it's seen as an extension of the maritime message. So of course, the Maritime and Colonial League only carries the word colonial in its name, starting in 1930. Before that, it's the Maritime and River League. Before that, it's the Union of Polish Sailors or something similar. The exact name escapes me at the moment. So the goal of this organization is to promote the expansion of the fleet, the merchant fleet, the navy, the development of the coast, the development of Gdynia, the new alternative port in the Polish Pomerania, on the Polish Baltic. So engagement of colonialism is seen as a continuation of this modernizing effort that takes place through the sea in Gdynia by merely expanding the maritime aspect of the Polish economy. So I'll leave it at that.
Sure, it is a very good answer. So we know exactly what that organization was doing and why it was important. Now there is another question more connected with research, and if the question is whether the writing of this book was difficult, and how important it was to find different documents in different archives, and where they are located in the United States or mostly in Poland, how this has happened, that all this material is connected all together in this book.
Thank you. That's also a great question. Yes, writing this book, doing the research for it wasn't the easiest task. Of course, it involved visiting all the archives that hold Polish documents from the interwar period. So the Józef Pilsudski Institute of America was one of them, of course, but also the Central Archive of Modern Records in Warsaw, the National Library, the Ossolineum in Wrocław. In London, it was the Polish Institute and Sikorski Museum. In Stanford, California, it was the Hoover Institution. And in addition to that, of course, I did visit the archives of the major colonial powers from whom Poland attempted to obtain concessions or outright colonies. So I visited the National Archives in London. I visited the diplomatic archives in Paris. I also traveled to the diplomatic archives in Berlin and to the Bundesarchiv, so the Federal Archive of Germany, also in Berlin, because I wanted to see the perspective of these powers, their attitude toward the Polish ambitions, to be able to corroborate some of the information that I collected in the Polish archives. So it was quite a task. It was it required corroborating sources from different institutions, but it was very much rewarding. I mean, I made some of my most interesting discoveries about the mission in Liberia, for example, in London, in the Polish Institute and Sikorski Museum. So it was definitely worth to scan every possible bit of evidence that exists on this topic. And perhaps with the exception of the Portuguese archives, I think that I've visited every significant and relevant institution in the world.
So thank you very much. It seems that it was a lot of work, but it was a journey through Europe and through history, which ended up in this great book. So I would like to welcome again everyone to purchase it. And I will have a pleasure to ask the last question, and it is connected with your research. I would like to ask, what are you working on now, and what are your research plans, and the books, and a new subject or continuation? Please let us know.
Yes, so I'm in the process of fishing for ideas for a new book. At the moment, I'm working on a minor project about the involvement of the diplomacy of the Polish People's Republic during the so-called thaw in the years 1956 to 1961, involvement in decolonization. So I'm looking at the ways in which Polish communist diplomats supported the Soviets in their support for decolonization movements, especially in Africa, and especially in the Congo. So I'm really interested in the role of the Polish diplomacy, also in the UN Security Council in the year 1960, especially with regard to the Congo. And in general, I am still interested in colonialism. I would like to examine the role of the Polish officers in British colonies in West Africa during World War II, and also the emergence of the Polish refugee camps in East Africa, in Tanganyika, in Uganda, and elsewhere after 1943, right? As you know, many of the Polish deportees to Siberia, after they moved with the Anders Army to Iran, many of them were moved to East Africa, to the refugee camps there. So I'm interested in how these phenomena contributed to Polish-African relations, and whether or not they had any impact on decolonization. So that's that, and I'll see where that takes me. I'm not coming up with any thesis yet, simply, once again, fishing for inspiration and for new ideas.
Thank you. It sounds really exciting, and there are a lot of subjects, probably a lot of ways to find answers, and we all will be happy to hear about new articles, new books. And on behalf of the Institute, I would like to wish you all the best, and thank you very much for spending this evening with us. And I would like to thank all our viewers, and hopefully we see each other in other webinars or in person. So thank you very much again, I would like to thank Dr. Piotr Puchalski for this exciting talk, and we will see each other soon with our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Once again, it was a real pleasure and a sentimental journey back to the Institute, albeit virtually. So I'm looking forward to seeing you and the community in person. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye and good
Bye.
night.